June 22, 1945. Okinawa. The cave smells of blood and fear. In the limestone darkness south of Shuri, 17 civilians huddle against the rock walls. Mostly women, children, and elderly men too frail to fight. They have been hiding for 6 days, subsisting on rainwater collected in helmets and fragments of rice balls gone moldy in the humid air. Outside, the battle rages in waves. Artillery thunder, the crack of rifle fire, the mechanical growl of American tanks pushing through the rubble of what was once their village. 8-year-old Kimiko Nakamura clutches her younger brother, his leg wrapped in strips of her torn tress. The wound, shrapnel from a mortar shell 3 days ago, has turned black at the edges. He no longer cries. He no longer moves much at all. Their grandmother rocks silently nearby, lips moving in prayers to ancestors who seem very far away. Then the voices come, American voices. Harsh syllables, incomprehensible words echoing through the cave entrance. The civilians press deeper into the shadows. They know what happens now. The soldiers have told them. The teachers, the officers, the officials who disappeared weeks ago, all of them said the same thing. The American devils will torture you. They will violate the women. They will bayonet the children. Better to die with honor. Better to detonate the grenades hidden beneath the rice sacks than face what comes next. Kimiko's grandmother reaches for the grenade. Her fingers close around the cold metal. But then the flashlight beam finds them. And the American soldier does something none of them expected. He lowers his rifle. He calls over his shoulder, not in rage, but in urgency. And within minutes, a Navy corpsman kneels beside Kimiko's brother with a medical kit, speaking soft nonsense words, cutting away the makeshift bandage with gentle hands. The grandmother's fingers loosen on the grenade. She does not understand what is happening. None of them do. For 4 years, the Japanese civilian population had been conditioned to fear American capture with an intensity that bordered on religious certainty. From newsreels, from school lessons, from government broadcasts, they had learned that the enemy forces descending upon the home islands were not merely soldiers, but demons, savage, cruel, incapable of mercy. Stories circulated of atrocities in captured territories, of civilians massacred, of children thrown from cliffs. The imperial government presented these narratives as incontrovertible fact, buttressed by carefully edited footage and survivor testimonies from those who had fled American advances.
Surrender, under this doctrine, was spiritual annihilation. Death was preferable. Death was honorable. On Saipan in July 1944, over 1,000 Japanese civilians threw themselves from the cliff tops at Marpi Point rather than face capture. Mothers clutched infants as they jumped. Fathers detonated grenades with their families gathered close. The suicides were not acts of desperation, but of ideological conviction. Better to die Japanese than survive in American hands. Then came the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where hundreds of thousands of civilians found themselves trapped in combat zones with nowhere to flee. And in cave after cave, rubble pile after rubble pile, they discovered that the demons were Red Cross armbands. U.S. Navy medical corpsmen and Army field medics treated Japanese civilian casualties with the same urgency they applied to American wounded. Orders from command were explicit: provide medical care to all non-combatants, regardless of nationality. But the policy was more than tactical calculation. It emerged from a deep-rooted American belief that medical ethics transcended battlefield allegiances. The Hippocratic tradition, carried across the Pacific in the rucksacks of 19-year-old corpsmen from Kansas and Georgia and Oregon. On Okinawa, Navy medical teams established civilian aid stations behind the front lines, treating malnutrition, infected wounds, diseases that had festered in the unsanitary conditions of siege warfare. Corpsmen distributed plasma, sulfa drugs, and morphine, supplies precious enough that their use on enemy civilians shocked even some American combat officers. A Marine company commander wrote in his diary, "Doc Phillips used our last bottle of plasma on a Jap kid who probably won't make it anyway. Some of the boys grumbled, but nobody stopped him. wouldn't be right to stop him. The Japanese civilians encountered a paradox that shattered their indoctrination. These Americans, who had incinerated their cities from the air, who had shelled their villages into ash, treated wounded children with a tenderness that contradicted everything they had been told. Corpsmen fashioned splints from rifle stocks. They shared their K-rations with starving families. They carried elderly civilians out of combat zones on stretchers meant for their own wounded. A woman named Masako Shimabukuro, interviewed decades later, recalled emerging from a cave on Okinawa with her 3 children. The American soldier gave my daughter chocolate, my daughter who had a burn across her back from white phosphorus. He called the medical man and they put white cream on her skin and wrapped it in clean bandages. Clean. I had not seen anything clean in 2 months. I had been told they would kill us. Instead, they gave us food and medicine. I could not reconcile these things.
The cognitive dissonance was profound and systematic. Japanese civilians expected brutality and received competence. They expected savagery and received bureaucracy. Forms filled out in triplicate, medical records maintained, tracking systems to reunite separated families. They expected extinction and received the mundane logistics of refugee management. Tent cities, meal schedules, inoculation programs against typhus and dysentery. By mid-1945, the U.S. military government on Okinawa was treating over 10,000 civilian patients daily in field hospitals and aid stations. Corpsmen performed surgeries in repurposed schoolhouses. Navy doctors set up maternity wards in warehouses, delivering babies whose mothers had spent months in caves. Pharmacists distributed quinine, aspirin, and vitamin supplements from supplies shipped across 6,000 miles of ocean for this singular purpose, to keep alive the civilian population of an enemy nation. One object became the unintended symbol of this ideological collision: the morphine syrette. Small, disposable, stamped with U.S. military markings, these single-use injectors delivered pain relief to wounded soldiers and civilians alike. Japanese civilians who had never seen such a device, who had endured surgeries with crude anesthetics or none at all, watched American medics press the syrettes into the arms of screaming children and saw the pain dissolve. The morphine syrette represented not merely pharmaceutical technology, but a philosophy that viewed suffering as something to be eliminated rather than endured. It was mercy, industrialized. The transformation in civilian attitudes occurred with startling speed. Within weeks of Okinawa's capture, Japanese civilians who had hidden from American patrols began approaching them voluntarily, carrying wounded family members, seeking medical help. The elderly, the injured, the sick. They walked out of the caves and the ruins because word had spread in whispers and broken sentences. The Americans have doctors, and the doctors will help you. This shift did not stem from naivety or weakness. It emerged from observable reality, repeatedly confirming what propaganda had declared impossible. A captured schoolteacher later wrote, "We were taught that Americans valued nothing but money and machines, that they had no concept of honor or compassion. But when their medical soldiers used their limited supplies to save our children, children who might grow up to fight them, I understood that we had been taught lies, or perhaps that there existed forms of honor we had not been permitted to recognize." The Japanese military authorities recognized the danger this posed to resistance efforts. Directives from imperial headquarters ordered the execution of civilians who accepted American medical care, branding them as collaborators. But the orders went largely unenforced, not from mercy, but from the simple fact that Japanese forces were collapsing, their command structure disintegrating, their capacity for ideological enforcement evaporating under the weight of material defeat. By August 1945, the U.S. field hospitals in the Ryukyu Islands were treating more Japanese civilians than American military personnel.
The logistical apparatus of war had been partially repurposed into an engine of humanitarian aid, not from altruism alone, but from a doctrinal assumption that civilian populations could be won through demonstration rather than domination. The American way of war included not only the capacity to destroy, but the capacity to rebuild, to heal, to administer. In the National Archives in Carlings Park, Maryland, there exists a photograph from Okinawa, July 1945. A Navy corpsman, face obscured by his helmet, name lost to history, kneels beside a Japanese child, no more than 5 years old. The corpsman is wrapping a bandage around the child's arm. The child is not crying. She is watching the American's hands with an expression that the camera cannot quite capture, but that anyone who looks closely can recognize: cautious, fragile hope. That photograph represents a truth that propaganda on both sides struggled to accommodate. Wars are fought between nations, but mercy operates at the level of individual human decisions. The corpsman who bandages the enemy child, the surgeon who operates on the civilian casualty, the medic who shares his morphine with a dying grandmother, these acts do not change the trajectory of battles or the outcome of campaigns, but they change the meaning of the war for those who survive it. The Japanese civilians who expected annihilation and received medical care carried that memory into the post-war world. It became part of the bedrock upon which reconciliation was built, not through treaties or diplomacy alone, but through the remembered experience of Americans who could have killed and chose instead to heal. Abundance, again. Not merely of weapons or tanks or ships, but of medical supplies sufficient to treat friend and enemy alike. Not merely of technology, but of a moral framework that insisted suffering should be alleviated even when expedience suggested otherwise. Democracy, expressed not in speeches, but in morphine syringes pressed into the arms of children who had been taught to fear the hands that held them. The caves of Okinawa are empty now, silent monuments to battles long concluded. But the lesson they taught remains: that the true measure of a nation at war is not only what it can destroy, but what it chooses to preserve when destruction would be easier. The corpsman's hands, gentle in the darkness, the child's wound cleaned and dressed, the grandmother's grenade, never thrown. These are the things that end wars more permanently than any surrender document. These are the memories that transform enemies into citizens of a shared future. The battle ended, the healing began, and in that sequence lies the difference between conquest and liberation.